Welcome to the History Maps podcast. So, if you were to open up a historical map of Southeast Asia, specifically looking at, say, the 7th century, you're going to see this really sprawling territory. It covers modern-day Cambodia, parts of Laos, Vietnam, and Thailand.
Right. It takes up a vast portion of the mainland.
Yeah, and right across this huge expanse of land, the cartographers have usually printed this single unified name, which is Chenla. And it looks incredibly official, It looks like a centralized empire with definitive borders, a single ruler sitting on a throne, and a unified citizenry.
Like a modern nation state.
Exactly, but the reality is, and this is what's so interesting, if you were to somehow drop down into the Mekong Delta in the year 600 and ask a local farmer for directions to the capital of Chenla, they would have absolutely no idea what you were talking about.
They would just look at you blankly.
Yeah.
I mean, that farmer identified entirely with their local village or maybe their regional chieftain, or at the very most, the specific river valley they lived in. The overarching monolithic empire that we see depicted on those modern maps is essentially a bureaucratic phantom. It didn't exist in the way we think it did.
Which is exactly why we are taking a deep dive into the sources on this civilization today. We are looking at the era spanning roughly from the mid-6th century to the year 802. And for a really long time, history sort of treated this period as a murky transitional blur.
Yeah, it was often viewed as just this awkward middle phase, like a bridge between the early maritime realm of Funan and the later highly recognizable Khmer Empire of Angkor.
Right. Just a stepping stone.
Yep.
But our mission today is to completely deconstruct that fragmented history for you. The goal is to show you how this patchwork of highly localized principalities actually served as the vital incubator for the religion, the statecraft, and the architecture of classical Khmer civilization.
And we're going to look at a variety of materials: the Chinese annals, the Sanskrit epigraphs that are physically carved into stone, and of course the actual ruins of ancient brick temples, just to uncover what was really happening on the ground.
Because doing that requires us to strip away a lot of historical mirages, right?
Absolutely. We are looking at a period that shifted the entire locus of Southeast Asian power. It moved away from coastal trade routes and went deep into the inland agrarian plains of the Mekong Basin and the Tonle Sap.
Which is a fundamental geopolitical pivot. But, as you pointed out in the sources, it is obscured by the very documents we rely on to understand it.
It really is.
Which brings us back to that name on the map. If the people actually living there never used the word Chenla, or I think the alternative spelling the sources use is Zenla, where did it come from? The text indicates it is entirely a Chinese exonym, right? Like it is completely absent from the old Khmer language.
Completely absent, yes. It appears exclusively in official Chinese imperial annals. So documents like the Book of Su and then later histories from the Tang Dynasty.
Okay, so why did the Chinese call it that? Well, you have to understand how the Chinese imperial bureaucracy interacted with these distant regions. It was primarily through tributary missions. And for the sake of just, simplified record keeping, Chinese chroniclers often grouped these highly fragmented autonomous principalities into a single vassal state.
Oh, I see. So it was just easier for the paperwork.
Exactly. To the Tang court, it was just much more efficient to label this entire shifting confederation of regional centers under one administrative heading, Chenla.
It's like calling the entire continent of Europe just Europe without acknowledging any of the individual countries or political divisions inside it.
That is a very apt comparison.
So the sources mention a few folk etymologies trying to figure out what the Chinese characters for Chenla were actually meant to mean. And some of the translations suggest it means pure beeswax, which sounds incredibly specific. It does sound specific, but it is actually tied to a very vital regional commodity. Beeswax was a highly valued trade item in the regional economy at the time. It was used for casting metals, it was used in various court rituals, and you see it frequently mentioned in Chinese trade records regarding Southeast Asia.
Oh, okay.
So naming a region after its primary export is a very plausible bureaucratic shorthand.
Like calling a place the Ivory Coast.
Precisely.
But there are other theories too, right? Some linguists look at the Tang Dynasty pronunciation, which they reconstruct as sounding like Sinliep, and they suggest it might mean defeated Siam, because it sounds phonetically similar to the modern Cambodian town of Siem Reap.
Right, but that theory has a severe chronological flaw.
Because of the timeline.
Exactly. The conflicts between the Khmers and Siam, which is the precursor to modern Thailand, those occurred centuries after the term Chenla was first recorded in these Chinese documents. You simply cannot name a region after a military victory that has not even happened yet.
That makes total sense. You also mentioned a variation found in later texts, Zanla, which historians suggest might mean defeated Chams, referring to the neighboring Champa kingdom.
Down the coast of central and southern Vietnam, yes. That is slightly more plausible, given the regional rivalries of the era. But ultimately, most historians agree that the original literal meaning intended by the Chinese chroniclers remains elusive.
Right. The key takeaway is just that it was an external label applied to a very complex internal reality.
Exactly.
So if Chenla is just a label placed on them by outsiders, how did the later Khmer kings actually explain their own origins? The sources show that if you look at Cambodian legend, they trace their royal lineage back to this very specific mystical union.
Yes, the myth states that a sage named Kambus Phayambuva married a celestial nymph and apsara named Mira, and this divine union supposedly created the House of Kambuj.
With an early king named Srutavarman supposedly founding the state, it is a very elaborate origin story.
It is, and it serves a highly specific political function. By linking earthly kingship to divine cosmic origins through an apsara and a sage, these later rulers were rooting their authority firmly in Hindu cosmology.
So elevates them.
Yes,
Yeah.
it elevates the king from being just a mere mortal warlord who won a few battles into a literal descendant of the heavens.
But here's the catch. The contemporary sources, the actual stone inscriptions from the 6th century that we have, they do not mention Srutavarman at all.
Not once.
They do not mention the sage Kambu, and they do not mention the celestial Apsara. The actual historical epigraphy points to a much more terrestrial, violent catalyst for the emergence of this state.
The physical evidence tells the story of a political rebellion, not a cosmic marriage.
Right.
In 514, a Fulanese ruler named Rudravarman usurped the throne by murdering the legitimate heir. Now, Funan was the dominant maritime power in the region at the time. This usurpation by Rudravarman sparked a widespread rebellion in the northern provinces along the middle Mekong River.
And the contemporary inscriptions point to actual historical figures leading this, right?
Right.
Like a nobleman named Brahmadatta.
Yes, Brahmadatta, and then later two brothers named Favavarma I and Chitrasena. These men are identified as the true historical founders of this independent entity.
Okay, so this brings up a really compelling question. If the actual history is that Pavavarman I and Chitrasena led a successful rebellion to overthrow a usurper, which objectively is a strong, heroic foundation story, why did later kings feel the need to invent the sage and the apsara?
Well, think about the precedent a rebellion sets.
Okay.
A rebellion, by definition, implies a severe disruption of the natural order. If your state is founded on the established precedent that a strong warlord can simply gather an army and overthrow the existing power structure, you are openly inviting future warlords to do the exact same thing to you.
Oh, wow. I mean, yes, that makes perfect sense. You don't want to glorify overthrowing the government when you are the government.
Exactly. The later Angkorian kings developed these mythological lineages to create an unbroken, sanctified connection to antiquity. They deeply needed a narrative of eternal, divine continuity to legitimize their rule, rather than a narrative of opportunistic military conquest.
Because divine right cannot be challenged by a rival general.
Precisely.
So we have this profound disconnect between the retroactive mythological history, the highly simplified Chinese tributary history, and then the harsh reality of regional rebellion. Which brings us to a fundamental shift in how this society actually operated. Because around 550, a figure named Hadravarman I, who the sources often associate with Pavavarman I, formally declared independence.
And he took a very crucial step to secure his local legitimacy. He married a northern princess named Lakshmi.
Which, according to the texts, is a recurring theme in Southeast Asian statecraft.
Very much so. The use of strategic marriage to bind regional power bases together was essential.
Following this, Pavavarman I and his brother, Chitrasena, aggressively dismantled the authority of Funan. They pushed south, capturing key urban centers and driving the Funanese elites away.
And when Havavarman died, Chitrasena took the throne under the coronation name Mahendravarman. He reigned from 600 to 611, and he continued this aggressive expansion across northern Cambodia, southern Laos, and northeastern Thailand.
But the sources make it clear this wasn't just a change in leadership. It was a complete geographic and economic pivot for the entire region.
A total reinvention. Funan was fundamentally a cosmopolitan coastal empire. Its wealth was derived heavily from maritime trade, from tolling the shipping lanes along the Gulf of Thailand, and acting as this crucial transit hub for merchants traveling back and forth between India and China.
And the leaders of Chenla just turned their backs on the coast.
They really did. They shifted the locus of power entirely inland, focusing intensely on the middle Mekong.
I was thinking about this, and it's kind of like a modern logistics company that has built its entire fortune by controlling a vast global shipping network. And then suddenly, the global trade routes shift, maritime revenues start to decline, and the executives decide on a radical pivot.
A complete restructuring.
Right. They abandon the ocean completely. They sell off the ships. They move their headquarters hundreds of miles inland, and they decide to establish a monopoly over vital domestic agricultural resources instead. It is a completely different business model that requires an entirely different type of infrastructure.
That analogy captures the severity of the transition perfectly. The wealth of the earth replaced the wealth of the sea.
Right.
Moving away from international maritime tolls meant they had to rely on the mobilization of domestic manpower and agrarian surplus. Specifically, they focused on intensive wet rice agriculture.
Okay, so let's unpack that. How does that actually change the daily function of the society? Because just picturing a farmer planting rice seems a lot simpler than managing an international shipping port.
On an individual, daily level, perhaps it is simpler. But on a state level, intensive wet rice agriculture is an incredibly complex engineering challenge. You are dealing with the monsoon cycle.
Which means torrential rains.
Right. Torrential rains followed by prolonged dry seasons. To produce a reliable, large-scale surplus of rice year after year, you cannot rely on natural rainfall alone. You must control the water.
Which requires extensive irrigation networks.
Precisely. You have to build immense reservoirs, which are known as barrages. You have to construct massive, very large embankments, canals, and moats. All of this to capture the monsoon rains and distribute that water slowly and evenly during the dry season.
So it is essentially terraforming.
It is. And managing these hydraulic networks requires centralized planning. It requires administrators, engineers, and most importantly, it requires thousands upon thousands of laborers to physically move the earth.
So by mastering this agricultural system, they are not just feeding people, they are building a highly effective mechanism for social control.
Exactly. The agricultural surplus allows the inland centers to sustain significantly larger populations. Those populations are then bound to the land and to the agricultural cycle, providing the essential manpower needed for further territorial expansion.
Because you know where everyone is and what they're doing.
Yes, and crucially, this demographic density provides the labor force required to build monumental stone and brick temples. You simply cannot build a temple complex if everyone is out foraging for food every day. You need a stable surplus to feed the artisans and the laborers while they build.
And this agrarian wealth fueled a rapid expansion. The kingdom really reached its zenith under two specific rulers, right? The son of Armin I, who reigned from 616 to 637, and later Jayavarman I, reigning from 657 to 681.
Correct. Isanavarman I is notable because he established a sprawling new capital called Isanapura, which is located at the modern archaeological site of Sambor-Prekuk.
Now, under Isanavarman I, the political structure of Chenla became highly pronounced. But the sources caution us that we really must discard the modern concept of a centralized nation-state. We are not talking about hard borders, customs agents, and a unified legal code.
No, not at all. Chenla operated as a mandala.
Right, the mandala system. This is a concept that is often difficult to map or even visualize because we are looking at a fluid confederation of agrarian principalities places with localized names like Anantapura and Vyadhapura.
Yes.
So if you are Isanavarman I, sitting in your capital of Isanapura, and you do not have a modern standing army or border checkpoints, how are you exerting any actual control over a decentralized network of autonomous warlords hundreds of miles away?
Is a great question. The mandala system functioned entirely differently from a territorial state. You should think of it as a center of gravity rather than a bounded container.
Okay, center of gravity.
Power was strongest at the very center, where the overlords resided, and its influence gradually dissipated the further out toward the periphery you went. To bind this loose network together, leaders relied heavily on religious patronage and ritual economy.
So they utilized religion as a political tether.
Yes, they heavily patronized the state worship of Shaivism. Specifically, they elevated forms of the Hindu god Shiva, such as Vajrasvara and Harihara. Harihara being a composite deity of Shiva and Vishnu.
How does elevating a specific deity actually translate to political control over a distant chieftain? Like, mechanically, how does that work?
Well, by establishing a state cult, The overlord positions himself as the earthly protector and conduit of the divine order. So let's say you construct a temple in a distant province and dedicate it to the state deity. That temple is not just a place of worship.
What else is it?
It functions as an administrative hub. It is a physical manifestation of the center's gravity out in the periphery. The local elites are expected to participate in the rituals of that temple. They donate land to it, they donate slaves to it, and in doing so, they are continually validating the ideological framework that places the overlord at the very top of the hierarchy.
So participating in the religion is participating in the state.
Exactly.
And beyond the temples, they also relied on personal ties. The sources note that Aizanavarman I married a princess from the neighboring Champa kingdom.
Strategic marriages were the secondary tether holding the mandala together. By marrying into neighboring royal families or the families of powerful regional chieftains, the overlord wove a complex web of familial obligations.
Right.
These personal, religious, and familial ties, that was the invisible infrastructure of the state.
But as we know, invisible infrastructure is inherently fragile.
Very fragile.
And that fragility was exposed dramatically following the death of Jayavarman I in 681. He had consolidated power across a vast territory, pushing his influence far up into the Laotian plateau. But he died without leaving a surviving male heir.
Which triggered a severe succession crisis. And this crisis reveals one of the most distinct and fascinating features of the Chenla political landscape. Because upon his death, his daughter, Queen Jayadevi, assumed the throne.
Right. The sources mention a Sanskrit inscription she left at the site of Angkor from the year 713, where she explicitly laments the bad times and the fragmentation of her realm.
She does.
Now, traditional colonial-era historians looked at this timeline. A king dies, his daughter takes over, and the realm shatters into warring factions. And they concluded that female rule was inherently rejected by the populace. They framed Queen Jayadevi as the direct cause of the civil war.
That is a deeply flawed, entirely outdated view that has been thoroughly deconstructed by modern scholarship. It really just reflects the inherent biases of early 20th century European historians.
Because they were accustomed to strict patrilineal succession.
Exactly. They projected European norms onto indigenous Khmer society, rather than looking at the realities of how that society actually functioned.
Let me push back on that for just a moment, just looking purely at the timeline. Jayavarman I commands a vast territory. He dies. Jayadevi takes the throne. The Chinese records show that shortly after, the whole region breaks apart. It is very easy to see why early historians connected those dots and concluded her gender was the destabilizing factor.
It is easy to connect those dots if you completely ignore the broader regional dynamics. The wider mandala of Chenla fractured because the personal charismatic ties that Jayavarman I had forged died with him, which, as we discussed, is a common vulnerability of the mandala system, regardless of the successor's gender.
Okay. The invisible infrastructure collapsed because the man at the center died, not because a woman took his place.
Exactly. And to understand how Khmer society actually viewed female power, we have to look away from the crumbling center and look at a principality called Sambupura, located along the middle Mekong.
Right. The sources detail that while the wider region was fracturing, Sambupura maintained extreme stability. And they achieved this stability through a continuous line of queens regnant. Indrani, Nirpatnadevi, Jayandraba, and Jaisthurya.
This highlights the really compelling tension between imported Indian ideologies and indigenous Khmer kinship patterns.
How so?
The formal court rhetoric, which was often inscribed in Sanskrit, heavily emphasized patrilineal descent and male cosmic kingship. It was a language of imported authority. However, the local Khmer societal structures, the actual day-to-day organization of the villages and the regions, were deeply rooted in bilateral and maternal lines of descent.
Meaning that property and status were actually passed down through the mother's side.
Exactly. Wealth, land ownership, and political power in these agricultural regions were frequently transmitted through the female line. The queens of Sampurpur were not mere placeholders, just keeping the throne warm for a male relative.
Right.
They were sovereign monarchs in their own right.
Let's look at Queen Indrani as an example. She inherited the Sampupura principality directly, and then she married a ruler named Pushkaraksha. Now, in a traditional patrilineal European model, the moment they marry, Pushkaraksha becomes the ruling king, and she becomes the queen consort.
But in the context of Sambupura, the roles were entirely reversed. Pushkaraksha was merely a king consort. The actual territorial legitimacy, The unquestioned right to rule the land, control the agricultural surplus, and command the populace resided entirely with Queen Indrani.
That is
It
fascinating.
is. The matrilineal line in Sampupura was a source of enduring stability, proving that indigenous Khmer society was completely comfortable with, and in fact structured around, female authority. So the collapse of the wider mandala under Jayadevi was a failure of decentralized network management, not a rejection of her gender.
That reframing completely changes how you view the political dynamics of the era. But despite the resilience of places like Sampapura, the broader confederation of Chenla did eventually split apart.
It did.
According to the Chinese Tang Dynasty annals, shortly after the year 706, the region formally divided into two distinct entities, Land Chenla and Water Chenla.
The Tang records provide a very stark geographic division here. Land Chenla, which is sometimes referred to as Upper Chenla, encompass the upland plains, the forested regions, and the mountainous terrain of northern Cambodia and southern Laos.
And the annals describe it as highly stable, right? Operating with around 30 organized administrative centers.
Yes, very stable. Now, Water Chenla, or Lower Chenla, covered the swampy floodplains of the lower Mekong and the coastal delta. And unlike its northern counterpart, Water Chenla was highly volatile. It functioned as a fractured zone of warring, localized fiefdoms.
So consider the geography for a moment. You have the inland mountainous region remaining incredibly organized with 30 administrative centers, while the resource-rich coastal delta descends into complete chaos and factional warfare. Why such a stark divergence of stability?
Well, geography is destiny in this context. The upland regions of Land Chenla were naturally insulated. The difficult terrain deterred external invasions, and their reliance on stable, inland agricultural bases allowed local rulers to consolidate power without constant disruption.
They were protected by the land itself.
Exactly. But Water Chenla faced the exact opposite conditions.
Because it is entirely open to the sea.
Completely exposed, Water Chenla lacked a strong central authority to coordinate a unified defense, and its extensive coastal position and complex river networks made it highly susceptible to external maritime threats.
And those threats arrived in force during the late 8th century. We see the rapid expansion of thalassocratic empires, sea-based empires operating out of the Indonesian archipelago.
Yes. Specifically, the sources mention the Shalendra dynasty based in Java and the Srivijaya city-state.
These maritime powers thrived on controlling trade routes and extracting wealth from weaker coastal regions, and they began launching severe, coordinated pirate raids up the Mekong Delta. They captured coastal towns, demanded heavy tribute, and just ruthlessly exploited the political fragmentation of Water Chenla.
And the sources provide a very specific, darkly compelling narrative vignette that illustrates exactly how the balance of power shifted during this period.
Right, it involves a young ruler of Lower Chenla named Mahipativarman.
It is a perfect historical example of the fatal consequences of misjudging the geopolitical landscape.
So Mahipativarman is holding court, and in a moment of extreme hubris, he publicly expresses a specific desire to his courtiers. He tells them he wishes to see the decapitated head of the Maharaja of Zabag, which historical consensus identifies as Java, presented to him on a plate.
Now, in the diplomatic networks of the 8th century, maritime merchants and envoys carry information just as quickly as they carry spices. Word of this specific insult traveled across the sea, and the Javanese monarch learned of the young ruler's demand.
And the Maharaja's response was not to send a diplomatic envoy to negotiate an apology.
No, not at all. He launched a vast naval armada. They sailed across the sea, entered the mouth of the Mekong River, and completely bypassed whatever fragmented, uncoordinated defenses Water Chenla might have mustered.
They sailed directly to the capital.
Directly to the palace, captured the royal palace, and seized Mahipativarman.
And the Javanese king publicly beheaded the young Khmer ruler, fulfilling Mahipativarman's wish to see a severed head on a plate in the most ironic and brutal way possible.
But the Maharaja did not stop at a mere execution. To ensure complete subjugation, the Javanese forces took several members of the Khmer royal family back to Java as political hostages.
When you look at the long-term impact of this event, it is profound. The execution of Mahipativarman essentially shattered whatever remnants of sovereignty Water Chenla possessed. It firmly placed the entire coastal and delta region under direct Javanese suzerainty.
The local warlords who had been busy fighting each other were now reduced to mere vassals of an overseas empire.
It was the absolute nadir of political power for the coastal Khmers. Yet what is notable about this era is that even as the political situation descended into subjugation along the coast, the cultural and architectural ambitions of the Khmers further inland did not cease.
They certainly did not. If we look back slightly to the capital of Isanapura, modern-day Sambor Prayakuk, we see a civilization that was highly creative and industrious despite the surrounding turbulence.
Right. Hisanapura serves as the premier archaeological laboratory for understanding the physical evolution of the Khmer state. The site is sprawling. It features over 100 red clay brick temples.
And the construction techniques utilized at Isanapura are a subject of intense study. They built these monumental structures using a highly specific method to bind the bricks together.
The sources mention that the joints between the bricks are virtually invisible. They did not use the thick, visible mortar that you see in traditional European masonry. How did they achieve that level of precision?
Archaeologists and engineers have analyzed the structures, and it appears they used a plant-based resin adhesive.
Okay, so a natural glue.
Yes, the laborers would take the fired clay bricks, apply this organic resin, and then physically rub the bricks together.
They rubbed them together.
Yes, the friction would grind the surfaces perfectly flat, creating an incredibly tight, seamless bond as the resin cured.
That sounds exhausting.
It required immense physical labor, but the result was a structurally sound wall with joints so thin they are barely perceptible to the naked eye.
And the exteriors of these perfectly joined brick walls were not left plain. One of the signature decorative motifs carved directly into the brickwork is what archaeologists call flying palaces.
Right. These are intricate miniature carvings of multi-tiered palatial complexes. They are populated by tiny, detailed figures of deities and celestial dancers. By carving these flying palaces onto the exterior of the temple, they were symbolically pulling the divine architecture of the heavens down and cementing it onto the earthly landscape.
When you look at the layout of these over 100 temples, it isn't random. The site reveals a deliberate process of architectural experimentation. The sources identify 3 distinct architectural prototypes at Isanapura, and each one points toward a different future in Khmer design.
Yes, let's explore those prototypes, starting with Prasat Sambor.
Okay.
Prasat Sambor is characterized by a square, pyramidal complex. Its design is entirely symmetrical. It radiates evenly in all 4 cardinal directions from a central elevated terrace.
Then you have the second prototype, Prasat Yaipun.
This complex represents a real shift in spatial philosophy. Instead of radiating evenly, Prasat Yaipun emphasizes a linear frontal perspective.
Like it has a clear front door.
Exactly. The architecture is designed to draw the worshipper's eye deeply inward along a primary central axis. Furthermore, it features lateral gopuras, monumental entrance gateways, built directly into its outer enclosure walls.
And the third prototype is Prasat Tau, which is also known as the Lion Temple.
Right, because of the prominent sandstone guardian lions flanking its central stairs. Now, Prasat Tau is similar to Yepon in that it is highly linear and emphasizes depth, but it notably lacks those lateral gopuras found in the second prototype.
So they are trying out different designs.
Yes, these 3 distinct layouts, the radiating pyramid, the linear design with lateral gates, and the linear design without gates, they did not exist in a vacuum. They served as the direct blueprints, the testing ground, for the vast, highly complex state temples constructed centuries later during the Angkorian Golden Age.
Let's consider the mechanics of a radiating pyramid like Prasat Sambor for a moment. Why construct a temple that opens equally to the north, south, east, and west? What does that layout actually mean in the context of this society?
Well, architecture in this era was fundamentally a tool of political domination and cosmological alignment. Prasat Sambor represents the genesis of the pyramidal state temple concept.
Okay, how does that relate to cosmology?
In Hindu cosmology, the universe revolves around a central cosmic mountain known as Mount Meru. By constructing a pyramidal temple with a central shrine that radiates equally in all directions, the ruler is physically replicating that cosmic mountain on Earth.
So it's a geographical broadcast of power.
Exactly. It allows the monarch to project his divine authority and prestige radially across his territory. The physical structure reinforces the ideological claim that the king is the center of the universe.
But constructing over 100 brick temples, rubbing every single brick together to create invisible joints, that requires an enormous amount of labor. We aren't just talking about a few skilled artisans, we are talking about grueling, large-scale physical work. How did they actually mobilize that workforce?
The epigraphist Judith Jacob provided crucial insight into this by analyzing the ancient inscriptions found at the sites. She identified 14 distinct categories of temple slaves tied directly to these religious complexes.
14 categories of slavery just for temple maintenance.
Yes. The mobilization of captive or indentured manpower was the absolute backbone of the agrarian and ritual economy. These individuals could be bought, sold, or donated to the temples by local elites to clear personal debts or gain religious merit.
So they were property of the temple itself.
Exactly. And they were highly stratified. Some cleaned the inner sanctuaries, some cooked the offerings, others maintained the vast temple grounds, and many provided the heavy physical labor required to transport materials, dig the reservoirs, and construct the towers.
The temples functioned as these powerful economic corporations that controlled vast holdings of agricultural land and human labor.
That is exactly how you have to view them.
So we have all these threads laid out. We have a civilization that has mastered the complex hydraulics of wet rice agriculture. They have developed a system of forced labor to build highly sophisticated brick architecture. They have conceptualized the state as a cosmic mandala radiating from a central mountain. But politically, they are still fractured. Water Chenla is subjugated by Java, and members of the Khmer royal family are sitting as hostages overseas. How do we get from this point of fragmentation to the mighty, unified Khmer Empire that builds Angkor Wat?
The catalyst for unification arrives in the late 8th century, and it comes in the form of one of those very hostages taken to Java by the Maharaja's armada.
Wait, really? A hostage returns?
Yes, a Khmer prince who had been observing the sophisticated court rituals and the centralized power of the Shailendra dynasty while in captivity returns to the mainland.
But he returns to a fractured landscape. He needs a power base to challenge the existing warlords. So what is his first strategic move? The sources say he marries Queen Jayandraba.
Which is a brilliant political maneuver, because if you remember, Queen Jayandraba is part of that highly stable, continuous matrilineal dynasty of Sambapura we discussed earlier.
He taps into the deep regional authority of the Middle Mekong.
Yes. By marrying her, he acquires the territorial legitimacy required to be recognized by the local elites.
He secures the land and the agricultural surplus. But he still needs a mechanism to formally throw off the suzerainty of the Javanese Maharaja and unite the disparate principalities of land and water Chenla under a single banner.
And he finds that mechanism in the year 802. The prince ascends to the summit of the sacred Mount Mahendra Parvata, which is known today as Phanam Kulen.
Okay.
There, he enlists a Brahmin priest named Hiranyadama to perform a highly specific, complex consecration ritual. Through this ritual, the returning prince is officially declared Jayavarman II.
And he gets some new titles as well.
Very important titles. He is proclaimed Chakravartin, which translates to Universal Monarch, and Devaraja, which means God King. With this single elaborate ritual on a mountaintop, he officially breaks from Javanese control and formally founds the Khmer Empire.
The question we have to ask, though, is how does a ritual actually centralize power? You cannot simply climb a hill, declare yourself a universal god king, and expect 30 independent warlords down in the valleys to lay down their weapons and submit to your authority.
It sounds absurd when you put it like that, yes.
The ritual has to carry an ideological weight that overrides their local autonomy.
And that is the brilliance of Jayavarman II. The Devaraja cult was a psychological and political masterstroke because he did not attempt to invent a new foreign religion to force on the people.
What did he do instead?
He wove together 3 powerful pre-existing strands of belief that the local elites and the common people already deeply understood. First, he incorporated the localized indigenous animistic cults that had worshipped mountain spirits for centuries.
Right. Tapping into the local roots.
Second, he integrated the imported Hindu cosmology of Shiva as the supreme destroyer and creator. And third, he utilized the existing political framework of the mandala system.
Let's look at how those 3 strands actually interact. He takes the local mountain deity, which the indigenous people already revere, and equates it with the universal cosmic power of the Hindu god Shiva.
Exactly.
Then he places himself as the sole earthly conduit for that combined divine power at the very center of the political mandala.
Precisely. Through the Brahmin's ritual, the divine energy is symbolically transferred into the linga, a phallic representation of Shiva, and from the linga into the physical body of the king.
It's a closed loop of divine authority.
The Devaraja cult provided an unassailable ideological framework. It completely changed the nature of rebellion. To raise an army against Jayavarman II was no longer just a standard political act against a rival warlord.
Because it became a severe cosmic transgression.
Yes, a transgression against the divine order of the universe itself.
This ideological fusion provided the centralized stability that the Chenla polity had historically lacked. It fused the disparate, warring principalities into a unified state capable of surviving and expanding for centuries. The legacy of Jayavarman II, built out of the ashes of Chenla, resulted in the enduring wonder of Angkor and the classical Khmer Empire.
However, there is a very dark modern epilogue to this history that we cannot ignore. The achievements of this era, the immense agricultural mobilization, the architectural prowess, they echoed violently into the 20th century. We really must look at how the history of the Chenla and the early Khmer Empire was misappropriated for tragic ends.
We have to discuss Saloth Sar, the man the world knows as Pol Pot.
Yes.
During his formative years studying in Paris in the 1950s, he engaged deeply with the history of the Angkorian and pre-Angkorian eras. He looked at the vast irrigation networks, the enormous agricultural surpluses, and the monumental architecture built by mobilized labor.
And he co-opted those ancient achievements for his modern political agenda with the Communist Party of Kampuchea, better known as the Khmer Rouge.
This historical co-optation became highly visible when the Khmer Rouge captured Phnom Penh in 1975 and established democratic Kampuchea. They adopted a new national flag. The design featured a yellow, three-towered temple evocative of the ancient ruins, centered prominently on a stark red background.
Pol Pot continually pointed to the ancient monuments and used them as direct historical justification for his radical agrarian communist revolution. His argument was essentially, if our ancestors possessed the capability to organize labor and build such stupendous marvels, then our modern revolution can surely achieve a super great leap forward, what they called the Mohalaut plow.
Which reveals a profound and deliberate ideological twisting of history.
It does.
It is a deeply tragic irony. You have an ancient society that was hyper-religious. It was an aristocratic system ruled by god kings, sustained by thousands of temple slaves, and administered by Sanskrit-reading elites. How does that specific historical reality become the inspirational blueprint for a radical, anti-intellectual Marxist-Leninist regime that sought to execute anyone who wore glasses or spoke a foreign language?
The Khmer Rouge achieved this through a violent synthesis of extreme nationalism and Maoism. To use the ancient empire as a model, they had to systematically strip the monuments of their complex religious and cultural context.
They just threw all of that out.
Completely. They ignored the Hinduism, the Buddhism, the profound Indianized cultural influence, and the sophisticated theology that actually inspired the construction of Isanapura and Angkor.
They erased the mind and worshipped the muscle.
That is a very accurate way to describe it. They repurposed the sheer scale of pre-Angkorian and Angkorian labor mobilization as be purely secular, nationalist symbol of peasant capability.
Right.
When Pol Pot looked at the intricate brick towers of Isanapura or the sprawling stone galleries of Angkor, he chose to see only the physical labor of the agrarian masses. He deliberately erased the diverse, complex, and highly stratified civilization that actually directed that labor.
It is a chilling reminder of how history can be flattened, stripped of its nuance, and weaponized to justify modern atrocities.
It absolutely is.
Which really brings us back to our starting point and the danger of oversimplifying history. The history of Chenla is not a clean narrative. It is muddy. It is filled with Chinese bureaucratic labels, retroactive mythological genealogies, fluid boundaries, external naval invasions, and complex religious synthesis.
But that murkiness, that lack of a clean linear narrative, is exactly why this era is so crucial to study.
We frequently dismiss periods in history as merely transitional or fragmented. We treat them as the messy, forgettable gaps between the big, famous, highly centralized empires. But consider this thought. What if the chaos is the point?
Right.
It was the severe vulnerability of the Water Chenla warlords, the steadfast matriarchal stability of Sambupura, the painstaking architectural experiments with invisible brick joints at Asanapura, and the fierce maritime conflicts with Java that forced the Khmers to adapt.
Exactly.
The fragmentation of Chenla wasn't a historical failure. It was the intense, grueling pressure cooker that ultimately forged the resilient cultural and political DNA necessary to build the enduring wonder of Angkor. The anatomy of greatness is almost always found in the chaotic periods of adaptation. Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.